It is right now 11:45 in the afternoon on Friday, October the 16th, 2020. And I've been working at the Aiken Fair, but took the hour and 20-minute drive over to Charleston, South Carolina this morning because I really wanted to go see Fort Sumter. This was something on my list this year. Didn't think I was going to be able to do it, but they've reopened the fort, so I'm going to do it. Now, if you're going to go see Fort Sumter, of course, it's like out in the ocean. You have to take a ferry out to see it. So you got to buy a ticket right here at this window. But before you go out there, you can go through this little museum here. And here they've got plenty of write-ups to give you all the information you need to have context on the fort itself before you go out there. I'm not going to read this out to you. Much of this information is readily available anyway. But this was where the Civil War started. Right here. So here is the ferry we're going to be going over on. I think it's kind of neat that you can see a military, what is that called? A destroyer, I think? Right out there behind it. This is still a very military occupied area. Some of you might remember last year I was out in Charleston when I went to see the Civil War submarine, the Hunley. And actually went fishing close enough that I could see Fort Sumter and pink it, but didn't get a chance to tour it before I had to leave. That was at the end of last year at the Coastal Carolina Fair. And then in July of this year, went over to Myrtle Beach and was close enough I could have drove out for a day trip to see this, but it was closed down then. Third try's the charm. Finally get to see it today. And it's very roomy in here. Socially distanced chairs. Because I think everybody's going up top. Got an educational video playing on loop right there. Maybe I'll just stay in here.
1809 to 1810. However, it played no active role until 1860. In December of that year, it was virtually undefended.
Our folks pulling up to the fort right now. I'm going to make a quick turn, then tie up to those docks. Two main goals here of the National Park Service. One is to keep you safe, the other one is to keep the resource safe as well. We will be here for an hour, and when the boat docks, I'll be back on the microphone.
All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and start disembarking the second deck. If y'all head out that front door, that'll take you directly to the exit. As you're disembarking, please make sure you watch your step, use the handrails, and keep social distancing in mind.
Wow, I can't believe it. I'm finally here. Fort Sumter, where the Civil War started. April 1861.
About a 10-minute history program. You follow that guy up there. You can follow that one up the stairs. Come on. If you're
Fort Sumter was first made, it was made to have about 135 of those cannons that you guys passed by when you first came through, right next to the doors over there. Those are called 42-pounders. That's because they shoot a 42-pound ball that would go about 1.5 miles. And if you look up the flagpole above me, you'll see a little red line. That red line indicates the height of the fort in 1860. The fort wasn't quite done. All the walls were up and not all the cannons were up. That's how tall the walls were. So definitely an imposing structure. And I know you guys want to talk about Fort Sumter during the Civil War, that's why you're here, but first I'm going to talk about Fort Sumter during the War of 1812, in that it didn't exist yet. During that war, the British were able to up the Chesapeake Bay. They got into Washington, D.C. pretty much unopposed. They burned down the White House, they burned down the Capitol building, and they burned down a whole lot more of the city. This made it painfully obvious to the United States that they had to rethink their system of coastal defenses, and part of that rethinking led to Fort Sumter. Because we had Fort Johnson over there to our southwest, and we had Fort Moultrie over here to our northeast. And in between those two forts was 3 miles of open water. Now, guns of that day only had a range of about 1 mile, maybe 1.25 miles if you were lucky. So there was a good amount of dead space in between the two forts that a ship could just sail right into if they were so inclined. And they needed somebody to bridge that gap, and that something is Fort Sumter. Construction began on the fort in 1829 with the creation of a man-made island by dumping more than 70,000 tons of rock and granite into the water below us. Now, all of that granite hauling and the making of the more than 3 million bricks that would one day make up Fort Sumter was done by the hands of enslaved people who would never be able to enjoy the freedoms that this fort was built to protect. Now fast forward a little bit to 1860. Like I said, the fort wasn't quite done by then. All the walls were up, not all the cannons were mounted, only about 15 of that 135. But South Carolina did a thing that wasn't quite unexpected, but was indeed unprecedented. It seceded from the United States. Now, Charleston only had one U.S. Army garrison anywhere in the area, and that was over at Fort Moultrie. That was headed by a man by the name of Major Robert Anderson. So Major Anderson, he knows about the secession of South Carolina, and he's worried that troops from this new independent republic are going to come and try to remove him and his garrison by force. He's only got about 85 men to his command at the time, and Fort Moultrie was in a little bit of disrepair. There were reports of cows coming in over the walls and grazing on his parade ground. And Major Anderson, being a man of at least reasonable intelligence, knew that if he couldn't keep out the local cattle, probably couldn't keep out the local militia either. So he made the decision on December 26th to pack up all of his men into rowboats, and they snuck over here in the middle of the night. And they raised the very first flag to ever fly here at Fort Sumter, and that was the 33-star American flag. It looks pretty similar to this one, just we have a few more stars now, and his flag was twice as large. But as you can imagine, that flag was easily identifiable from the Charleston Peninsula, and identify it they did, and they were none too pleased, because to them, this was the flag of a foreign nation. So they did everything in their power to get them to take it down and head back up north, but that didn't happen. Nothing really changed for the next 4 months. It wasn't until the end of that 4 months, in April of 1861, that the U.S. sent a telegram down here to the governor of South Carolina, told him they were sending a resupply convoy escorted by warships down here to Fort Sumter. Now, the South Carolina government and the brand new Confederate States of America had been really hoping that the U.S. was just going to evacuate their troops out of Fort Sumter and take them back up north, but it's evident that if they're going to be resupplying Fort Sumter, that they're not planning on leaving anytime soon. This was unacceptable to the Confederates, so they took matters into their own hands. First thing that they changed was that the mail and the fresh food that had been allowed to come to and from Fort Sumter was immediately stopped. Second thing, the Confederates had about 700 troops garrisoned in the various forts around Charleston Harbor. They added more than 3,000 men in less than a week after that telegram came. And lastly, the Confederate Secretary of War ordered Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, who was actually a former student of Robert Anderson from West Point, to demand the evacuation of Fort Sumter or else to begin its bombardment. So on April 11th, Beauregard sends a letter over here. He tells Anderson that if he agrees to leave, that Beauregard will let them take down their flag, take all their men, take all their goods, take all their guns. Beauregard will even give them a Confederate ship to take them to any Union post that they choose. They just have to get out of town. Anderson, however, refuses this offer. He says he's got orders to stay here in Fort Sumter. They go back and forth about this a little bit until finally Beauregard sends one last letter. He says, Anderson, if you don't leave, I've got orders to shoot on you. Anderson accepts this, signs it back. He's an experienced officer. He's been in war before. He knows what this means. At 4:30 in the morning, April 12, 1861, a shot comes from Fort Johnson. It explodes over Fort Sumter, and that's a signal shot to all the other batteries in the harbor to begin firing on the fort. Now that bombardment lasted for about 34 hours. You had more than 3,000 Confederate shells hitting this fort. There wasn't a whole lot of damage, however. Like I said, they were dealing with those 42-pound cannons, and that's exactly the kind of gun that Fort Sumter was built to withstand. So you had some dents in the bricks on the outside, but otherwise most of the walls were pretty well intact. The big problem was that at least one of those cannonballs had been heated up red hot in the furnace, and it landed in the officers' quarters here behind you guys, which wouldn't have been a big problem, except that the officers' quarters was right next to the powder magazine. So that suddenly became a little bit problematic. They had to go and they sealed that up with sod, which was great because that meant they weren't going to explode. Wasn't so great because it meant that they didn't have anything to fire back at the Confederates. So finally, after those 34 hours, they raised the white flag and agreed to those original terms of evacuation. As Beauregard promised, he did let them take their flag up back north with them, and Anderson took it to New York, where they displayed it in Union Square to a crowd of more than 100,000 people. Now, this was more Americans than had ever gathered in one spot up to that point, and it marked a significant change in the ethos of our nation. Before then, people had been fiercely loyal to their individual states, but after that display of the flag, people started to trade that in for patriotism for their nation. The Confederates would stay here in Fort Sumter for pretty much the entirety of the war. The Union saw Fort Sumter and Charleston as a whole as symbols of the rebellion and the secession, and consequently focused a considerable amount of effort on their recapture. Beginning in 1863, you would have seen a line of Union ironclad gunboats out here in the harbor, and later that year they captured points on Morris Island, and they began to fire on Fort Sumter from both of those places. Now, the difference between these two bombardments, the first and the second one, is that the Union came with cannons more like this one. This is called a Parrott rifle, and the reason it's called a rifle is because it's got some grooves cut inside of the bore, and those grooves put a spin on the projectile. This did a few things. Made it so that you could fire a whole lot more accurately, and that made it so you could fire a whole lot further, and you could fire with a whole lot more power. So these bigger, better guns were firing on Fort Sumter for about 22 months, almost 2 whole years, and that's really what did the damage that you can see. These two walls were completely gone, and the back walls behind you were reduced to almost 1/2 of one level, to the point that you can see them today. So they reduced it to almost nothing but sand and rubble, but the Confederates never surrendered it. It wasn't until February of 1865 when Union General William Sherman captured Columbia just about 100 miles up the road, burned it to the ground. This spooked the Confederates here in Charleston enough that they decided to evacuate all of their men, including out of Fort Sumter, and go up to North Carolina to regroup. This allowed the Union to reoccupy Fort Sumter just 2 months before Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. A few days after that surrender, Robert Anderson comes back here. He was by then breveted a Major General, and he raised the very same flag that he had lowered here exactly 4 years before. Just as Fort Sumter had served as a symbol of the disunion of the nation, he now had it serving as a symbol of its reunification. And the flag of the United States has been flying here just about every day since.
A few places where you can still see the shells embedded in the wall. Here's one of them right here. Right there. Surprised they're actually allowing people to touch these. Seems like if you got a whole group of people around them to really wrench on it, there's a chance you might be able to pull it out. They're not going to allow that though. A little bit further down, there's another one over here. So the way that's pointing, it would have had to have come from over the wall, up in that direction. All the way over the wall, through the fort, and embed itself in here. Sometime in those 21 months of siege, back in 1864, I believe, 4 or 5. 4 and 5, realistically, 21 months. And there it is from the outside, standing on the island. Well, looks like it's about time for me to get back on the ship and head back into Charleston and go on to work. But this was finally something I can cross off that bucket list and say that, yeah, it's smaller than I thought it would be, but the story and the history and the way that you can see how much this fort changed from the beginning to the end of the war, and then even after the war, over 600,000 deaths. If you added up all of the Americans that died in World War I, II, Korean War, and Vietnam, it still wouldn't be the same as the amount of Americans that died in the Civil War. And that was because it was Americans against Americans. Every death was an American death. Oh. Okay, they're calling me to go back. Alright, guys. If you are anything of an American history buff, then I would encourage you to come on out here. You can really feel the history here. It is totally worth it. It's only $25. A 30-minute ferry ride there and a 30-minute ride back. All the educational talks, everything, even the museum, all of that all together for $25. So totally worth it. It's a little restrictive once you're inside. Oh, there we are. Steps. It's a little restrictive once you're inside. A lot of barricades and chains, but you can understand why they're there. Alright guys, if you've enjoyed this at all, please make sure to indicate so by giving me a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure to ring the bell icon. Go over and select all. I'll talk to you down in the comment section. And look forward to seeing you in the next one.